A lot of times when we talk about the Old West, we tend to focus on the so-called gunfighters. And for good reason. I mean, love them or hate them, guys like Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp lived extremely fascinating lives. But that said, not everyone in the Old West was an outlaw or a lawman. A lot of very normal, everyday people had some very exciting adventures. And today we're going to examine 4 such characters. We'll start off with the story of James Beckwourth. Born a slave around the turn of the century, Beckwourth gained his freedom and headed west looking to make a name for himself. He trapped beaver alongside legends like Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, fought in battles ranging from the swamps of Florida to the Pacific coast and even as far north as Montana, and rose to prominence as a leader among the mighty Crow Nation. And Beckwourth was still out there scouting on the frontier well into his 60s. Or at least he was until he died under very mysterious circumstances. Next, we'll discuss the legendary William Bigfoot Wallace, a giant of a frontiersman who initially headed west looking to avenge his brother's death. And in doing so, would go down as one of the most iconic figures in all of Texas history. This dude served in the Texas Revolution, survived a Mexican prison, and faced off against Comanches, yet somehow lived long enough to see the invention of the automobile. But much like Beckwourth, Wallace's life was not without controversy. Was Bigfoot really the hero the Texians make him out to be? Or was something much darker lurking beneath the surface? Also discussed are my own personal opinions regarding mixing history with politics. By the way, I've gotten a lot of requests to wear a cowboy hat while I'm doing these episodes, and I've even had people offer to send me custom-made cowboy hats, which I really do appreciate, but I don't really need it because I was able to borrow a hat from my 4-year-old daughter. I don't know, I kind of like it. What do you think? After Wallace, we'll take a look at famed buffalo hunter Billy Dixon. In the summer of 1874, Billy and just 27 others were attacked by an overwhelming force of some of the fiercest warriors to ever draw a bow. Outnumbered more than 20 to 1 with no way out, the odds weren't just bad, they were downright hopeless. That's when Dixon pulled off the impossible. He raised that old Sharps rifle of his and made what would go down as the shot of the century, dropping a mounted warrior at nearly 1,500 yards. Less than 3 months later, Dixon would be pinned down yet again, this time in a buffalo waller. And even though he was wounded, he did manage to rush through a hell of bullets to save one of his fellow scouts, an act that would eventually earn him the Medal of Honor. Just one of 8 civilians, by the way, to ever be awarded the Medal of Honor. Finally, we'll close things out with the life of an unlikely hero known as Stagecoach Mary Fields, a lady who, despite being born a slave, was once described as one of the freest souls to ever draw a breath, or a .38 revolver. Stagecoach Mary drank hard, she worked hard, and she fought hard, taking on everything from drunken cowboys to packs of wolves and even Montana blizzards. Yet in the end, she remained gentle enough to hand out candy and babysit the local children, one of whom would grow up to become an extremely famous actor, whose work I guarantee you that you're familiar with. Ooh, who could it be? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. James Pearson Beckwourth was born into bondage in Frederick County, Virginia, sometime around the year 1800. His father was a plantation owner by the name of Sir Jennings Beckwourth, a nobleman of Irish and English descent who had served in the American Revolution. And his mother was an enslaved black woman whose name has since been lost to history. Now, the Beckwourth family would move to Missouri at some point when James was still a child. And by the time he reached his late teens, his daddy had set him up as a blacksmith's apprentice over in St. Louis. Details are sparse, but James would remain with the blacksmith for the next few years, before eventually getting fired after getting into an altercation with his boss. Apparently, things grew so heated that he ended up pulling a pistol. Luckily for James, that's also when his father executed a deed for emancipation. In other words, Beckwourth was granted his freedom, just in time to join one of the most legendary expeditions in all of the American West, at least in my opinion. A little something known as Ashley's 100. And at the center of it all was the fur trade, an industry that was most definitely a booming at the turn of the 19th century, mostly on account of fancy felt hats that were all the rage back east and over in Europe. The French Canadians, first began trading goods with the indigenous in exchange for pelts all the way back in the early 1600s. The practice soon spread, and over the course of the next 200 years, everyone else just sort of followed suit, including the Americans. Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the subsequent Lewis and Clark expedition would only serve to open up even more territory for the burgeoning trade. So much so that by the year 1808, a guy by the name of Andrew Henry had already established a trading post on the Three Forks of the Missouri, not far from present-day Bozeman, Montana. Turned out to be a very short-lived venture, though, and thanks to increasing pressure from the locals, namely the Blackfeet, Henry and his buddies were forced to haul ass back to the settlements. Skip ahead to 1822, and that's when Henry partnered up with William Ashley and formed the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Don't worry, we're getting back to Beckwourth in just a moment, I promise. Just giving a little context. Now, up until this point, the Americans, and pretty much everyone else, had traded with the Native Americans to obtain fur, at least for the most part. And what Ashley and Henry were hoping to do was to cut out the middleman by installing their own fur trappers out west in the Rocky Mountains. So that being the case, they posted an advertisement in St. Louis looking to hire, quote, 100 men to ascend the River Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. And yeah, the young men who answered this call to adventure, now known as Ashley's 100, were a veritable who's who of soon-to-be famous mountain men. Guys like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, and yeah, even our own James P. Beckwourth. Eventually. You see, when James had that big fallout with the blacksmith, he fled north to the lead mines for a spell, and then south to New Orleans. As such, he wouldn't sign on with Ashley until the summer of 1824. So if you listen to that series I did on Jim Bridger, or even the episode on Hugh Glass, Beckwourth was not present during that big fight with the Rickera, nor was he there when Glass got mauled by the bear. And by the way, just an FYI, I'm not entirely sure why he changed his name from Beckwourth to Beckwourth, or even if he changed it at all. Maybe it was just a translation issue. But I will most likely be referring to him by both names throughout the course of this episode. Just didn't want to confuse anyone. Now, on the off chance that there are any new listeners who may not fully understand what I mean when I say fur trappers, it's basically what it sounds like. These guys were spending months at a time just wading in freezing rivers and creeks, or cricks as they called them, setting and baiting literal wrought iron traps for beavers. The animals were then skinned and the hide fleshed and then stretched out to dry. What resulted is what the trappers referred to as a plew or a pelt. And just to give you an idea, beaver pelts are currently, as of this recording and to the best of my knowledge, selling for somewhere between $20 or $30 a piece. And back in 1824, in a place like St. Louis, you could sell a plew for around $8, which adjusted for inflation is over $250 in today's money. And really, it was just supply and demand. Like I said earlier, the beaver felt hats were in fashion among the Gentiles, so buyers were paying a premium. Thus, the adventurous young men like Beckwourth were incentivized to head out into the great unknown. It's worth noting that this was a very dangerous job. These guys just weren't on a picnic out in the forest. Once they got a little ways outside of St. Louis, there was absolutely nothing that even so much as resembled civilization. At least not civilization as they knew it. There were Mexican settlements in the Southwest as well as on the West Coast. You had a few British trappers in places like present-day Washington state. They'd also eventually raise a few outposts. There were Russians off the coast of Alaska, and of course, you had the ever-present French Canadians up north. You also had hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples, all of whom had their own unique cultures and languages and religions. The fur trappers were not the first people to see any of the various landmarks that they would end up naming or being known for. Virtually every mountain pass and every stream and every desert trail had already been discovered hundreds, if not thousands of years prior. Okay, I'm not trying to denigrate the very rich traditions of the Western tribes, nor am I attempting to whitewash their existence or even label them as quote-unquote uncivilized. All I'm trying to convey is that for the fur trappers, specifically Beckwourth and the others who joined up with Ashley, this was a brave new world. One that, while populated, had nothing in the way of conveniences they were used to back east. No doctors or judges or lawyers, no churches, no printing presses, and definitely no grocery stores. These guys were completely on their own as far as their survival was concerned. They had to hunt for every meal, they had to locate fresh water and grass for their horses, act as their own veterinarians and doctors. They had to be able to travel hundreds of miles without a map or compass, to mend their own clothing, to fix their own tools, and to occasionally stomp their own snakes. I hate that I even have to offer up these types of disclaimers, but that's what I meant when I say that the fur trappers had nothing in the way of civilization once they hit the mountains. That said, they would get quite a bit of help from the indigenous. In fact, most of your Rocky Mountain fur trappers, Beckwourth included, would eventually end up, for a lack of a better term, going native. They'd oftentimes establish their winter camps with people such as the Crow or Shoshone. They'd assimilate, intermarry, have children. Hell, they'd even participate in raids against their adopted tribe's enemies. By the time a guy like Beckwourth had spent his first winter out west, he would have been almost indistinguishable from the natives, at least from a distance. Long gone were the wool or homespun clothes he had wore back in St. Louis. He would have instead been decked out from head to toe in buckskin. His hair was long and adorned by feathers, and even his boots would have been replaced by moccasins. As far as the tools of the trade, each of the trappers had what they referred to as a possibles bag. This is where they kept all the little necessities, stuff like a flint and steel for starting fires, maybe some char cloth, and all for making repairs, a pipe, tobacco, sometimes even lead balls for their firearms. And that's another thing. This was way before people had 6-shooters and repeating rifles. The long guns that the fur trappers carried were of the single-shot black powder variety. And contrary to popular belief, Hawken rifles really weren't all that popular when Ashley's men first headed west. I have no way of proving this, but just based on contemporary accounts, James Beckwourth would have most likely carried either a Kentucky or English trade rifle. He would have also had a brace of flintlock pistols, a tomahawk, several trade knives, extra lead and powder, of course, spare traps, a few blankets, maybe even a mule or two, and if he was smart, a good deal of trinkets to trade with the indigenous. And really, that's about it. That's all they had to survive in a very harsh and unforgiving environment. And although many of the western tribes were indeed friendly, there were others who didn't much appreciate these foreign trappers encroaching on their land. So on top of being able to survive in the wilderness, Beckwourth and his companions also had to provide their own security. Not only that, but they had to figure out a way to get all that beaver fur back to the markets, as well as securing provisions for their next season. Thankfully, this problem was solved in 1825 when Ashley and Henry began using overland wagon trains to bring both the market and supplies to the mountains. Rather than the fur trappers spending months traveling back and forth to St. Louis, they would instead meet in a predetermined location out west for what they took to calling the annual rendezvous. Now, this was initially purely transactional, just a convenient way for them to sell their pelts and re-up on supplies. But in time, the rendezvous would morph into a drunken month-long party, especially once the whiskey arrived. And by the time everyone was either broke or had their fill of excitement, they'd load up and head out once again in search of that sweet, sweet beaver. Thus was the life of a Rocky Mountain fur trapper. Now, before we examine Beckwourth's various adventures, it's worth pointing out that most of what we know about the man comes from his own autobiography. And well, let's just say that these mountain men weren't exactly the best when it came to factual renditions. Truth be told, these guys were pretty legendary when it came to spinning yarns. James Beckwourth included. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that he was probably one of the worst offenders. And it's not necessarily that he was a liar, per se. I have no doubt that he stuck mostly to the truth when it mattered, like conversing with his fellow trappers or when he was serving as a guide and a scout. But as far as everyone else, it was open season, including his own biographer. So that being the case, many of Beckwourth's stories, although containing kernels of truth, are highly exaggerated. Case in point, Beckwourth claimed to have been captured by a Crow war party in 1828. According to him, he was then mistaken for the long-lost son of one of the chiefs and adopted into the tribe. Not only that, but he would then go on to become the main chief of the entire Crow nation. In all reality, Beckwourth was sent to the Crow voluntarily on behalf of his bosses at the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, just as a way to establish trade. And although he would never become the head chief, he would eventually hold a certain level of authority. All total, James would spend around 8 years with the Crow. He was privy to their councils, he joined in on their rituals and hunts, and even married a young female warrior by the name of Pine Leaf. So yeah, it's not always easy to tell where the truth ends and the fairy tales begin, especially in the 1820s. But like I said, there's always a kernel of truth in there. James Beckwourth did live with the Crow for quite a while. And he also trapped with Jim Bridger for several seasons prior to living with the Crow, during which time he had many a violent encounter with the Blackfeet. In fact, it was his prowess in battle that earned him the name of Bloody Arm. Maybe. There's also another story claiming that he earned the Bloody Arm handle by killing a huge grizzly with nothing but his bare hands. Remember what I said about tall tales. We also know that Beckwourth would occasionally make trips out west to steal horses from the rich Californios. According to historian Jerry Ensler, quote, in 1836, Pegleg Smith and Jim Beckwourth went to California with Ute Chief Walkara to still animals from ranches and missions near Pueblo de Los Angeles. And then in 1839, they returned to carry out a huge raid in the vicinity of the mission at San Luis Obispo, midway between San Francisco and Los Angeles. They used mares in heat to lead more than 3,000 horses from the Mexican ranches, making the raid the largest livestock theft in California history. Pegleg Smith admitted, "I came near going under. Them Spaniards followed us and fought us in a way the Spaniards were never known to do." End of quote. Now, this was in the late 1830s, and this was a very transitional period for the fur trappers. Not only did changes in fashion greatly decrease the demand for beaver pelts, but the animals themselves were growing more and more scarce. This, coupled with an economic depression known as the Panic of 1837, effectively meant that the mountain men had to find a new line of work, James Beckwourth included, which, in hindsight, is probably why he took to stealing livestock. Of his time in the mountains, Beckwourth would later state, "I had encountered savage beasts and wild men, and what had I to show for so much wasted energy and such a catalog of ruthless deeds?" By the way, this is also about the same time that his own adopted tribe, the Crow, were ravaged by smallpox, and according to some, Beckwourth was to blame. This has never been proven, but it did cause his reputation to suffer, both among the Crow and even some of his fellow fur trappers. But then again, so did stealing all those horses over in California. So, that being the case, Beckwourth returned to St. Louis in the fall of 1837, just looking for a change and hopefully a new line of work. As fate would have it, that's also when a general by the name of William Gaines was recruiting seasoned frontiersmen to head down to Florida and take on the Seminole. And for the princely sum of $50 a month, I guess Beckwourth had a hard time saying no. There was a lot going on with this conflict, what's now known as the Second Seminole War. I'm not going to get into it today. I do hope to cover the Seminole some point in the future. But this was no cakewalk, okay? By the time it was all said and done, over 15 U.S. soldiers were dead, along with a few thousand Seminole. As for Beckwourth, he ended up spending around 10 months there in the swamps, both as a mule skinner and a dispatch rider. And despite his tendency towards exaggerations, his description of the Battle of Okeechobee, hope I'm pronouncing that right, lines up almost perfectly with the historians. And once the fighting began to slow down is when Beckwourth once again became restless. Or as he put it, quote, "We had another long interval of inactivity, and I began to grow tired of Florida. I wanted excitement of some kind. The Seminoles had no horses worth stealing, or I should have certainly exercised my talents for the benefit of the United States." End of quote. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by me, Josh. Let me ask you a question real quick. What if every time you went to go check the date, you discovered something new about the Old West? Or better yet, what if you found out that you shared a birthday with someone like Jesse James? Or that your wedding anniversary was on the same day as the Battle of Little Bighorn? Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, that's why I went ahead and created the Legends and Outlaws wall calendar. And no, this is not just some boring calendar with the show's logo plastered on it. Not only does it include traditional holidays, stuff like Christmas and 4th of July, but you'll also find all kinds of notable dates from the Old West. Everything from birthdays to deaths and even historic shootouts involving guys like Billy the Kid and Wild Bill Hickok. For instance, I am currently recording this on October 27th. Hang on a second. Here we go. October 27th, 2025 is when I'm recording this ad spot right now, okay? Just yesterday was the 144th anniversary of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And today, at least as of this recording, marks the birthday of Joseph Medicine Crow. I did an episode on Mr. Medicine Crow a long time ago, but if you're not familiar, he was the last war chief of the Great Crow Nation. This dude was raised by actual warriors who roamed the Great Plains and grew up to count coup on Nazis during World War II. And if there's one thing I like more than Old West history, it's Nazis getting their heads bashed in. And tomorrow, at least as of this recording, marks the birth of the great cattle king, John Chisholm. It's all here on the calendar, and as you can see, there were plenty of other notable dates that also occurred in October. Everything from the Daltons getting wiped out over in Coffeyville to the death of Richard Two Gun Hart. Remember him, Al Capone's prohibition agent brother? And even the day that Tom Tobin delivered the head of Felipe Espinosa. It's all there on the calendar. But wait, there's more. Each month also features a different full-page historical photo. And yeah, the photos are different for every single month. We got everyone from Billy the Kid to Judge Roy Bean, and even my own personal favorite, Sitting Bull wearing sunglasses. Okay, so if you're tired of boring wall calendars and you want to surround yourself with all the gunslingers and warriors and outlaws of the American West that we normally talk about here on the Wild West Extravaganza, head on over to wildwestcalendar.com and secure a calendar, or 2 or 3. I really do think this is a great gift for any history buffs in your life, or Western fans, or just anyone who appreciates a nice quality piece of art. And it's just in time for Christmas, all right? Or Hanukkah, or Kwanzaa, or whatever you celebrate. So what are you waiting for? That's wildwestcalendar.com. Wildwestcalendar.com, wildwestcalendar.com. Don't just mark the date, make it legendary. Now, let's get back to the show. So yeah, Beckwourth ended up returning to St. Louis once more in search of a job. Luckily for him, his old buddies Andrew Sublett and Louis Vasquez were looking for a steady hand at one of their posts on the Platte River. And that being the case, Beckwourth was hired on to establish trade among the neighboring Cheyenne, a tribe who just so happened to be enemies of his old friends, the Crow. And despite another trader, William Bent, warning Beckwourth that the Cheyenne would make sausage out of him, he did manage to win him over. Hell, trade was even so good that fall and winter that Vasquez was able to pay off all of his debts. Unfortunately, the success was very fleeting, and by 1840, Vasquez was forced to sell the post. But be that as it may, Beckwourth continued trading with the Cheyenne. He'd even form a trading post of his own in what's now Pueblo, Colorado. This is also when he tied the knot with a young Mexican gal by the name of Luisa Sandoval. Now, there's not a lot known about Beckwourth's various personal relationships, including this one. If I'm not mistaken, he'd get married for a third time later on. And I'm also not sure how many children he had. As far as I know, he would have at least one son with his Crow wife, they named George, but I'm not really sure when it comes to all the specifics. Now, as good as things were going there in Colorado with the Cheyenne, Beckwourth's old colleagues, Charles and William Bent, felt like he was encroaching on their territory, to the point that they actually started writing letters to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs asking for military intervention. Now, it never came of it, but this was yet another blow to Beckwourth's reputation. So once again, he pulled up stakes and headed to California. Only thing is, rather than establish trade, he instead found himself knee-deep in a revolt. Turns out just a couple of years prior, California Governor Juan Alvarado was forcibly replaced by Manuel Micheltorena. Many of Micheltorena's troops were convicts recruited from Mexican prisons, and their behavior there in California, which included a whole hell of a lot of looting and mistreatment of the locals, caused resentment among the California landowners. And by the time Beckwourth arrived in 1844, guys like Pio Pico and Jose Castro were rallying the opposition and calling for an open revolt. Now, from what I understand, once again, details are sparse, but I do think that Beckwourth aligned himself with the governor and his forces. Or at least he did until the United States declared war on Mexico in April of 1846, at which point he and some of his buddies stole around 1,800 horses and headed back to Pueblo, Colorado. Unfortunately, it was not a happy homecoming. In Beckwourth's absence, his wife Louisa had remarried. She offered to get back with him, but James instead opted to, quote, enjoy once more the sweets of single blessedness, end quote. He'd go partners in a hotel down in Santa Fe for a while before once again signing on with the Army as a scout during the Mexican-American War. I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record at this point, but I'm honestly not too sure exactly what Beckwourth was up to during this period. There's just so many stories and contradictions that it can be very hard to keep track. There is some indication that he may have participated in the Bear Flag Revolt with Kit Carson and Fremont, but so far as I'm aware, he did not take part in the Battle of San Pasqual. And following hostilities, he remained there in California. He even took to working a mail route between Monterey and Napoma. In fact, if you've ever heard of the brutal Reed murders at Mission San Pasqual, it was Beckwourth who discovered the bodies while ferrying the mail. Now, this was a pretty grisly murder. There were 11 victims all total, including William Reed, his wife, and their 2 children, a toddler and a newborn. Beckwourth rode for help, and then he led the posse that went in pursuit of the killers, which are described in some sources as being a mix of Englishmen, Irishmen, and Americans. They managed to locate him not too far from Santa Barbara, and Beckwourth led the charge. And once the smoke cleared, the alleged murderers were dead. In the years that followed, Beckwourth did a little prospecting, especially after gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, but his main source was trading with the other miners. He had him a little post in the Sierra Valley, just west of present-day Beckwourth, California, Had his own ranch, and he also discovered a mountain pass along what's now I-70. Still bears his name to this day. Matter of fact, for a brief period, the so-called Beckwourth Trail was one of the most popular routes into California. It was also there in California that he dictated his memoirs, The Life and Adventures of James P. Beckwourth, which were published in 1856. To readers back east hungry for adventure, it was pretty gripping stuff. But to historians, it's an absolute nightmare. Dates are wrong, names are mangled, and critics ended up labeling him a liar, sometimes with open racial contempt. But nevertheless, beneath all the exaggerations lay some of the richest first-hand accounts of life among the Crow. And really, this was Beckwourth's greatest contradiction. He was a man of undeniable experience, but he was discounted, mostly due to not always telling his story the way society expected. Then, of course, there's the fact that he was mixed race. For all of Beckwourth's accomplishments, many of his contemporaries viewed him as little more than a curiosity. Someone to be quoted around the campfires, but not to be taken seriously in the history books. But then again, Beckwourth didn't exactly do himself any favors with all of his questionable choices, not the least of which was his participation in the Sand Creek Massacre. If you're not familiar, in 1864, a militia under the command of noted douchebag and purveyor of hate, Colonel John Chivington, attacked a friendly Cheyenne village along Sand Creek, some 140 miles east of present-day Colorado Springs. People there in the village believed themselves to be under the protection of the U.S. government. Hell, they were even flying an American flag over the camp. Didn't matter to Chivington, though. And by the time he and his men were done, somewhere between 70 and several hundred Cheyenne were slaughtered, most of whom were women, children, and the elderly. Beckwourth was there, serving as a guide and interpreter. But as to whether or not he got his hands dirty is unknown. And by the way, this is the same massacre that I discussed in the Silas Soul episode, so we definitely know that there were soldiers there who refused to take part in the killing. I'm just not sure if Beckwourth was among them. In later testimony before Congress, he claimed that he was forced to go along and that he feared for his life if he refused. And when he tried to relay what the survivors had told him, military officials cut him off, calling his words treasonous. So yeah, like I said, man, this is yet another chapter of Beckwourth's life where we really don't know who's telling the truth. And to this day, it's unclear if he was a willing participant or just a man trapped by circumstance. Either way, his reputation, say it with me, class, once again suffered. Not only was his relationship with the Cheyenne severed beyond repair, obviously, right? But even his former friends like Kit Carson condemned Chivington as a dog and his men as dirty hounds. But even so, Beckwourth continued scouting for the army, even well into his 60s. A dangerous job, to say the least. One that often demanded long and sometimes solo rides through hostile territory. Beckwourth may not have been the lean young trapper of his youth, but he did have a whole hell of a lot of experience. And just to give you an idea how formidable he still was, this is also around the same time when he came out on top in a gunfight over in Denver. So yeah, Beckwourth may have been well past his prime, but he was still a force to be reckoned with. Nothing lasts forever though, right? And whether or not we like it, time catches up with us all. So it were in late 1866 that Beckwourth's body began to fail him. He had been guiding soldiers from Fort C.F. Smith to a Crow village near the Bighorn River when he developed headaches and sudden nosebleeds. And by October, he was dead. Now to this day, nobody knows exactly what caused Beckwourth's demise. Per historian Sean Dolan, quote, according to persistent legend, Beckwourth's return to the Crow was cause for great celebration. A huge banquet was held, and the village elders recounted all the tales of bravery and valor from the glorious times when Beckwourth had been their chief, before the soldiers had come to the mountains. They asked him to become their chief once again, but he refused, graciously, explaining that he was tired and old. On the night before he was to leave, a great feast in his honor was held. The drums played and the Indians danced, and Beckwourth was fed poison. For even in death, he would be good medicine. End of quote. Now, if this is true, it doesn't really explain why the Crow would beg for him to become their leader one moment and then kill him the next. But I suppose it could have been payback for the smallpox epidemic years prior, or Sand Creek, or even just the fact that he was now working with the army. But then again, many of the Crow warriors also scouted for the army, so doesn't really make sense. There are also other stories claiming that it was the soldiers who poisoned him, mostly due to him hesitating to lead them to the Crow. which once again does not pass the smell test. This is all just speculation, by the way. There is zero evidence that Beckwourth was poisoned. Far as we know, he could have just simply been sick. Maybe he had a brain hemorrhage. I mean, that would explain the headaches and the bloody nose. Hell, it could have even been complications from a stroke, maybe an old head injury, or something as simple as high blood pressure. Either way, Beckwourth's remains were handled by the Crow. They laid him to rest per their customs and in an unknown location, somewhere in what's now Wyoming. No great monuments were raised, no town bells rang in his honor, and outside of a few frontier circles, Beckwourth's passing barely even made the papers. But love him or hate him, he was most definitely the real deal. Born into slavery and freed by his own father, Beckwourth carved out a place in a world that refused to acknowledge him. He trapped beaver with the great mountain men of the Rockies. He lived as a Crow warrior, guided immigrants across the Sierras, and fought in wars ranging from Florida swamps all the way up to Montana. Facts may blur, the dates may wobble, and the tall tales may grow taller with each new telling, but the man himself remains undeniable. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on James P. Beckwourth. Yeehaw! How far would you go to settle a score? Well, for a guy like the legendary Bigfoot Wallace, the answer was simple. As far as it took, and maybe even a few steps beyond. You see, Wallace was initially drawn to Texas in order to avenge his brother's death. And then, over the course of his career as a Texas Ranger, he'd square off against everyone from Mother Nature to Comanche warriors and even Mexican soldiers. A lot of Mexican soldiers. Wallace served hard time in prison. He narrowly escaped death on multiple occasions, and at one point he was even forced to draw his own life from a jar. White beans for the living and black for the condemned. And through it all, he survived. By the time it was all said and done, Bigfoot Wallace would go down as one of the most iconic figures in all of Texas history. A man celebrated for his courage, feared for his brutality, and immortalized in a haze of tall tales. But just how true are the stories? Is Bigfoot Wallace really the hero that Texans make him out to be? Or is something much darker lurking beneath the surface? How exactly did he earn the nickname Bigfoot? And is it true that he once ate 27 eggs in one sitting? Stick around and find out, including my own personal opinion about mixing politics with history. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! William Alexander Anderson Wallace was born in Lexington, Virginia on April 3rd, 1817. And aside from having a mouthful of a name, there's really not a lot known about Wallace's early life. Shocker, right? As far as I can tell, he had a fairly normal childhood, just growing up there in Virginia and working on his daddy's orchard. This would change drastically in the spring of 1836. That's when young William learned that his brother Sam, along with one of their cousins, had been killed down in Texas. A little incident known as the Goliad Massacre. If you're not familiar, that's when the Mexican general Santa Anna ordered the execution of over 400 Texians, unarmed men who had surrendered thinking that they'd receive clemency, only to then be gunned down or bayoneted in cold blood. As I'm sure you can imagine, Wallace took this personally. He also vowed to take, quote, pay out of the Mexicans. And yeah, just a few months later, at the tender age of 19, he left home looking to do just that. The only thing is, by the time Wallace arrived in Texas, the revolution was already over. So rather than exact revenge, he instead took to farming down in LaGrange, which, according to the great Charlie Robinson, is too damn hot. I guess William felt the same way as he'd soon relocate, first to Austin and then to San Antonio. By the way, before we go any further, we do need to address Wallace's physical stature. In a day and age where the average American male was around 5'7" tall, Wallace was a towering 6'2". He was also said to have been 240 pounds worth of solid muscle. As to how exaggerated these claims are, I really can't say, but he does appear to be quite the tall drink of water if his photos are any indication. In fact, his large frame may have even contributed to his nickname. More on that in just a bit, but in 1842, Wallace would finally get a chance to avenge his brother's death. You see, the revolution may have ended way back in 1836, but old Santa Anna was still chomping at the bit to regain control of Texas. And that being the case, he ordered General Rafael Vasquez, along with a force of around 700 soldados, to occupy San Antonio, which they did on March 5th, 1842. They would withdraw just a couple of days later and head back to Mexico, but a similar invasion occurred the following September. Only this time it was twice as many soldiers under the command of Mexican General Adrian Wall. And once again, they were able to capture San Antonio. In response, our very own Bigfoot Wallace joined up with Colonel Matthew Caldwell and famed Texas Ranger John Coffee Hayes. As such, he would play a very active role in the Battle of Salado Creek. Per historian Sam Haynes, quote, "On September 17th, the Texans engaged Wall's troops northeast of San Antonio and repulsed several assaults by Mexican infantry at the Battle of Salado Creek. During the course of the fighting, a company of 53 Fayette County militiamen, under the command of Captain Nicholas Mosby Dawson, arrived on the scene, but they were intercepted by Mexican cavalry before they could join the main Texan force. 2 men managed to escape. The rest were killed or taken prisoner in what would become known as the Dawson Fight. 2 days after the fighting, Wool's army evacuated town and took with it a few dozen Anglo prisoners and as many as 200 Tejanos who feared reprisals if they remained. Hayes and Caldwell pursued the retreating Mexican army to the Hondo River, where they briefly attacked Wool's rear guard before breaking off the pursuit." End of quote. So yeah, Wallace finally got a chance to engage the very same army that had killed his brother and cousin. And in just the Battle of Salado Creek alone, they were able to kill over 60 of the Mexican soldiers and send the rest packing. But be that as it may, I guess Wallace felt like he hadn't fully settled the account, as just 2 months later, he would sign on with the ill-fated Somervell expedition. And when I say ill-fated, it was a complete and total disaster. They left San Antone, several hundred strong under the leadership of Alex Somervell, looking to punish the Mexicans and hopefully get rich in the process. Unfortunately, they also failed to secure adequate provisions. They weren't properly equipped for the weather, they got lost on the way there, and morale plummeted. Nevertheless, they did make it to the border, and they did regain control of Laredo, at which point Somervell just went ahead and ordered his men to return home. According to Texas historian Joseph Nance, quote, "Little energy had been shown in prosecuting the campaign, which apparently was undertaken as a political move to appease demands for an invasion of Mexico and to reveal the futility of sustaining an attack upon Mexico without adequate supplies, equipment, and discipline. The Texans were so disappointed with the order to disband that only 189 men and officers obeyed. Some 308 men under 5 captains and commanded by William S. Fisher continued to Mexico on the Mere expedition." End quote. And yeah, the great William Bigfoot Wallace was right there with them. He was also among those who attacked the town of Mere on Christmas Day, 1842, an action that saw over 60 of his companions killed as he and the others were taken prisoner. Like I said, this entire expedition was doomed from the get-go. Why they thought they could take over Mere, even though they were outnumbered 10-1, is beyond me. But they did try, and like I said, although they fought bravely, Wallace and the survivors had no other choice but to surrender. Bigfoot would later express his emotions in a racially charged diatribe, saying that he'd never forget the humiliation at having to lay down his arms. Now, he and a few of his buddies would stage an escape, overpowering their guards and hightailing it to the desert, but they were all captured within a week. Not only that, but they were then sentenced to death by none other than Santa Anna himself. Luckily for Wallace, the Mexican officers had mercy on him, and rather than slaughter the entire bunch, they instead selected just 10 of the invading Texans for execution. I say they selected, but in all reality, it was more of a lottery. They placed a large number of white beans in a jar, along with 10 black beans, and each of the Texans were then forced to take turns reaching inside and drawing a bean. Those who were lucky enough to grab white ones were spared, but the unfortunate 10 who drew black beans were then placed against a wall and summarily executed via firing squad. If this sounds familiar and you didn't grow up in Texas like I did, you may be thinking of Larry McMurtry's Dead Man's Walk. Not only is Bigfoot Wallace featured in both the book and the film adaptation, but they also showed the bean incident. Only difference is, in McMurtry's version, Wallace is among the executed. In all reality, he was one of the lucky ones who managed to draw a white bean. He still wasn't completely off the hook, though. He and his compadres were then taken to Mexico City and forced to work on chain gangs, before being transferred again to the infamous Perote prison in September of 1843. And it's there where they stayed until their release nearly a year later. And my apologies if I got Perote prison wrong. Perote prison, Perote, I think it's Perote. Now, just to give you an idea how badly they were treated, Wallace would bear the scars from his shackles for the remainder of his life. In fact, in a letter to his father, he would admit that he had, quote, "undergone more than I had any idea human nature could bear," end of quote. Now, just as soon as Wallace got back to Texas, he joined up with the Texas Rangers under the able leadership of the aforementioned John Coffee Hayes. It's worth noting the Texas Rangers back in the 1840s were quite a bit different from the professionals of today. The men who Wallace served with were a mostly ragtag bunch of frontiersmen, nearly as wild, if not more wild, than their indigenous opponents. They fought hard, they drank hard, and in time, they would come to master the art of guerrilla warfare. Or to quote another Texas historian, T.R. Fehrenbach, they were one of the most colorful, efficient, and deadly band of irregular partisans on the side of law and order that the world has ever seen. And yeah, their main job, or at least when Wallace was riding with them, was to protect the settlers from the Comanches and their various allies. And it would be with the Rangers that Wallace would experience what he described as his toughest battle of them all. The fight in question occurred in the spring of 1846, after a Comanche war party struck the settlements near San Antone. Hayes and his Rangers, Wallace included, tracked the warriors for days before deciding to abandon the trail and try to get ahead of them. Apparently, either Hayes or his Tonkawa scout figured that the Comanche were heading to a well-known watering spot along the Concho River, a place known as Paint Rock, not too far from present-day San Angelo. Rangers arrived after dark, quickly set up an ambush, and sure enough, right at the ass crack of dawn, here comes the Comanches. At which point Wallace and the others unleashed an absolute hellstorm, with both men and horses dropping under their steady aim. Okay, fine, but the Comanche Nation ain't exactly known as being pushovers, right? They quickly rallied and began charging the outnumbered Rangers. Hostilities would die down that evening, once the sun set, only to renew first thing the following morning. Once again, the Comanches charged the beleaguered Rangers, wave after wave. And although they never did manage to break through, it did seem to everyone involved that it was just a matter of time, especially considering that the Rangers were running low on powder and lead. That's when Captain Hayes drew a bead on one of the main chiefs and blew him plumb out the saddle. Sort of like what would occur at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls nearly 3 decades later. And I guess the Comanche figured that their medicine had gone bad. They called off the attack just like that and beat feet for the Llano. It weren't long after this that Wallace would head south of the border yet again, this time as Lieutenant and Captain Gillespie's Texas Mounted Volunteers, which, truth be told, was just another way of saying that they were Texas Rangers attached to the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War. I can't say for certainty how many skirmishes that Wallace would personally take part in, but he was there for the Battle of Monterey, a bloody affair that cost the lives of some 120 Americans and over twice as many Mexican soldiers. And due to their actions there in Monterey, as well as similar battles, the Mexicans soon took to calling Wallace and his fellow Rangers Los Diablos Tejanos, or for those of you who don't habla Espanol, the Texas Devils. And once the war was over, Wallace headed right back home and continued serving with the Rangers. In fact, by the 1850s, he had a company of his own. Wasn't just fighting Comanches and sassy bandits, though. You see, Wallace was so good at tracking that he'd also routinely be called upon to apprehend escaped slaves who were headed to their freedom in Mexico. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is history in a nutshell. You know, it can be very easy to want to look up to someone like Bigfoot Wallace, and I totally get it. He really was a larger-than-life character, a true frontiersman who proved his bravery time and time again. But he was also a massive hypocrite, and a bit of a bastard to boot. Keep in mind that Wallace knew exactly how it felt to be held in bondage. Not only had he himself been forced into slave labor down in Mexico, but his body still bore the scars from the shackles. And yet here he was just a few years later, denying freedom to his fellow man. And that's okay. Well, his actions aren't okay. It was a pretty shitty thing to do. What I mean is that it's okay to discuss his actions. You're not going to magically turn into a communist just by learning about verified historical events. I promise. You know, I've been doing this show for, over 6 years now? And the one thing that I've learned is that there are two very different prevailing models when it comes to how we view history. On one side, you got people, like I just mentioned, who only want to discuss the stuff that makes America, or America's so-called heroes, look flawless and beyond reproach. And if you ever veer off the path and say something that doesn't line up with their very narrow worldview, then you're accused of being a liberal revisionist. And on the other side, you've got the exact opposite. Political activists masquerading as historians. People who just use history as a way of trying to shame others or virtue signal. And you know the types. They can't discuss any historical events without, in the very same breath, mentioning how evil Americans are and how horrible we should feel about our past. It's my opinion that both of these groups are doing a great disservice, not only to history, but to people like me and you who have a genuine interest in history. Now, me personally, I like it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't think we have to suppress history just to further our own agendas, and we certainly don't have to water it down to make ourselves feel all warm and fuzzy on the inside. All these people that we discuss here on the Wild West Extravaganza, whether it's Bigfoot Wallace or Jesse James or Billy the Kid, they were all mere mortals. They made mistakes, they made bad choices, they wrestled with their own ethics or lack thereof. Sometimes they did really cool stuff, and sometimes they did things that I think most of us would consider reprehensible. And it's okay to talk about it. Contrary to popular belief, you can discuss history without also comparing every single historical figure to literally Hitler. And it's also possible to discuss the bad aspects of history, like Bigfoot Wallace chasing down runaway slaves. Doesn't mean that you're woke. At the end of the day, all we're doing is simply studying the lives of people who lived in the past, and hopefully learning from their mistakes. And unless you're willing to acknowledge the mistakes, we will end up repeating them. Us humans throughout the course of history, up to and including our present timeline, haven't always been the best of neighbors to one another. And Bigfoot Wallace, colorful and brave as he may have been, was certainly no exception. Case in point, in early 1848, Wallace led a contingent of Rangers to attack an unsuspecting, and up until then, friendly, band of lawmen Apache. Lawmen. I think that's how you pronounce it. Per Gary Anderson in The Conquest of Texas, quote, Ranger Bigfoot Wallace, who lived in the area at the time, described the troubles with the lawmen Apache as being directly related to settler occupations of the Medina River Valley. The lawmen Apache resisted and protested to the Rangers for 2 days, and then departed, vowing revenge. Small parties of lawmen Apaches returned and took a number of animals, although supposedly no one was killed. One of the mules driven off belonged to Bigfoot. Wallace waited until the Indians assumed they were safe in the spring of 1848, and then he gathered together 30 Rangers and stalked their new village. It was nestled in a rugged valley at the head of the Frio River, nearly on the edge of the Great Plains. End of quote. So yeah, apparently Wallace wasn't too happy about this mule being stolen, so they attacked a camp and killed several of the Apaches as the rest of them scattered for the brush. According to John Duvall, who was not only present for the raid but would later write Wallace's biography, Bigfoot, quote, could not help feeling some compunctions of conscience for the bloody awakening that was soon to rouse up my old friends and allies from their morning slumbers. But then, when I thought of the scurvy, rascally trick they had played on me, I dismissed all such ideas from my mind and made my arrangements for an immediate attack upon the encampment. End quote. Now that little bit about the lawmen being his old friends and allies, that's on account of them joining up with the Texans during the Revolution with Mexico. They also scouted for the Rangers against the Comanches and Kiowas, and according to Wallace himself, he had even once lived with a Lapan. He personally knew these people. He had worked with them on multiple occasions, sat down and ate with them, and now here he was, ready to shed untold amounts of blood over a stolen mule. Now, believe it or not, Wallace would actually try and spare a young girl who had recognized him and clung to his shirt, begging for mercy. But sadly, she was still shot, allegedly by her own people, during the chaos of the battle. According to Wallace, he had tried his best. He even stated that in her final moments, she had begged him not to kill her father and mother, and that it caused him to regret attacking the village. Quote, the sort of life that I had led had not been one particularly to soften a feller's heart, but I am not ashamed to own, as I gazed upon the stiffening form of this forest child, so cruelly cut down by the hands of her own friends and relatives, that my eyes were dimmed with tears, and I sincerely wished on her account that I had permitted her tribe to go unpunished for breaking the treaty they had made with me. End of quote. He then changes his mind, saying that regrets are useless, and he and the Rangers continued killing. The superiority of our weapons, especially the revolvers, more than made up for our deficiency in numbers, and they at length gave way. Breaking into little squads, they fled in every direction before my men, who followed them in the same disorderly manner. All total, according to Wallace, they ended up killing 48 lawmen Apaches, only 21 of whom were warriors. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by me, Josh. Let me ask you a question real quick. What if every time you went to go check the date, you discovered something new about the Old West? Or better yet, what if you found out that you shared a birthday with someone like Jesse James? Or that your wedding anniversary was on the same day as the Battle of Little Bighorn? Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, that's why I went ahead and created the Legends and Outlaws wall calendar. And no, this is not just some boring calendar with the show's logo plastered on it. Not only does it include traditional holidays, stuff like Christmas and 4th of July, but you'll also find all kinds of notable dates from the Old West. Everything from birthdays to deaths and even historic shootouts involving guys like Billy the Kid and Wild Bill Hickok. For instance, I am currently recording this on October 27th. Hang on a second. Here we go. October 27th, 2025 is when I'm recording this ad spot right now, okay? Just yesterday was the 144th anniversary of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And today, at least as of this recording, marks the birthday of Joseph Medicine Crow. I did an episode on Mr. Medicine Crow a long time ago, but if you're not familiar, he was the last war chief of the Great Crow Nation. This dude was raised by actual warriors who roamed the Great Plains and grew up to count coup on Nazis during World War II. And if there's one thing I like more than Old West history, it's Nazis getting their heads bashed in. And tomorrow, at least as of this recording, marks the birth of the great cattle king, John Chisholm. It's all here on the calendar, and as you can see, there were plenty of other notable dates that also occurred in October. Everything from the Daltons getting wiped out over in Coffeeville to the death of Richard Two Gun Hart. Remember him? Al Capone's prohibition agent brother. And even the day that Tom Tobin delivered the head of Felipe Espinosa. It's all there on the calendar. But wait, there's more. Each month also features a different full-page historical photo. And yeah, the photos are different for every single month. We got everyone from Billy the Kid to Judge Roy Bean, and even my own personal favorite, Sitting Bull wearing sunglasses. Okay, so if you're tired of boring wall calendars and you want to surround yourself with all the gunslingers and warriors and outlaws of the American West that we normally talk about here on the Wild West Extravaganza, head on over to wildwestcalendar.com and secure a calendar, or 2 or 3. I really do think this is a great gift for any history buffs in your life, or Western fans, or just anyone who appreciates a nice quality piece of art. And it's just in time for Christmas, all right? Or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever you celebrate. So what are you waiting for? That's wildwestcalendar.com. Wildwestcalendar.com, wildwestcalendar.com. Don't just mark the date, make it legendary. Now, let's get back to the show. Now, in addition to all that rangering and chasing down escaped slaves, Wallace also drove a mail coach between San Antonio and El Paso, a punishing 600-mile route through some of the most dangerous country that Texas had to offer. Bandits, Comanches, Apaches, and even the desert itself stood ready to kill a man the very moment he let his guard down. And at one point, it damn near put Wallace under. As it were, some natives just stole his mules, so he was left stranded hundreds of miles from the nearest town, and with no other choice but to continue on foot. Legend has it that he stumbled onto a homestead days later, half-starved and asking for food. From Hispanics, no less. You know that had to hurt his feelings. All they had available were eggs, so he downed a total of 27 before continuing on to El Paso for a proper meal. Now, when the Civil War broke out, Wallace, like many of the other Rangers, opted to remain in Texas and continue guarding the frontier from hostiles. And yeah, the Comanche and the Kiowa were still a very real threat during this period. I've spoken about this before, but during the early 1860s, the line of the frontier there in Texas was pushed back at least 100 miles, with some counties being almost completely depopulated. Most of the able-bodied men were back east fighting Yankees, so there wasn't a whole hell of a lot to stop the Comanche raids, other than men like Bigfoot Wallace. Of course, by that point, he was already well on his way to becoming a living legend, known as much for his enormous frame and booming laugh as he was for his prowess in battle. In time, Wallace would put down roots in a little community there in South Texas known as Bigfoot, about 40 or so miles southwest of San Antonio. He never would marry or have children, but he also never seemed to lack for company in his old age. People would travel from far and wide just to hear him spin tales in the shade of his cabin, leaning back in an old rawhide bottom chair, pipe in hand, and a mischievous glint in his eye. Wallace wasn't all that big on letting the truth get in the way of a good story, but lack of veracity notwithstanding, the man was a gifted storyteller. He told of battles, prisons, and narrow escapes, never failing to keep his audience laughing or shaking their heads in disbelief. To many, he was the epitome of a Texas frontiersman, And to others, he was simply a reminder of how violent the West truly was. And yeah, Wallace would eventually pass away there in Bigfoot, Texas, on January 7th, 1899, at around 82 years of age. A short while later, his body was moved to the state cemetery, where he was laid to rest near Stephen F. Austin and other iconic figures from Texas history. Now, before you go, I do have a few other odds and ends to discuss, not the least of which is how Wallace earned the nickname Bigfoot. By the way, when it comes to someone like Bigfoot Wallace, it is not easy to separate fact from fiction. There's just so much folklore surrounding this guy that it can be very difficult to know where the truth ends and the fairy tales begin. As for his nickname, there are three main theories, none of which have been proven to any degree of certainty. One of the theories, according to Wallace's own friend and biographer, John Duval, states that he earned the name after getting into a fight with a giant of a Waco Indian, who, as fate would have it, was named Bigfoot. Apparently, Wallace came out on top, so from that point on, people took to calling him by the same name as his vanquished foe. Another theory from historian Andrew Sawwell poses that in 1839, Wallace was accused of committing petty theft that was actually committed by a local Native American. They both wore moccasins, so in order to prove his innocence, Wallace placed his own moccasin foot into the much larger footprint of the real thief. And from that point on, the name stuck. And then finally, the theory that I think is probably the most likely, albeit not nearly as exciting, is that Wallace simply had large feet. Did you know that Bigfoot Wallace was possibly the inspiration for Conan the Barbarian? Turns out the guy who invented Conan, author Robert E. Howard, was a huge fan of Texas history, and there's even correspondence between him and H.P. Lovecraft discussing Wallace. According to Howard, Wallace was, quote, perhaps the greatest figure in Southwest legendary. Hundreds of tales, a regular myth cycle, have grown up around him. But his life needs no myths to ring with breathtaking adventure and heroism. End of quote, and there you have it. So you tell me, who was the real Bigfoot Wallace? Was he truly a courageous hero like Howard claimed? Was he a vile monster who spent his life persecuting those who had the misfortune to be indifferent, like the Mexicans and natives and escaped slaves? Or was he just somewhere in the middle, a man of his times who, while certainly not lacking in the courage department, oftentimes made some very questionable choices? A man capable of extraordinary feats of bravery, but also at the same time, stomach-churning acts of barbarism. Yeehaw! In the summer of 1874, a small group of buffalo hunters were attacked by an overwhelming force of Comanches, Kiowas, and Southern Cheyenne. Outnumbered more than 20 to 1 and with no way out, the odds weren't just bad, they were downright hopeless. That's when one of the hunters, Billy Dixon, pulled off the impossible. Raised that old Sharps rifle of his and made what would go down as the shot of the century, dropping a mounted warrior at nearly 1,500 yards. A shot that not only changed the course of the battle, but possibly even the history of the Southern Plains. Less than 3 months later, Dixon would be pinned down yet again, this time in a buffalo waller. And despite being wounded, he still managed to rush through a hell of bullets to save one of his fellow scouts, an action that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. But who was Billy Dixon? Is he really the frontier legend he's made out to be, or just another lucky marksman who happened to be in the right place at the right time? And did he really pick that warrior off at 3/4 of a mile without a scope? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. William Billy Dixon was born in Ohio County, West Virginia on September 25th, 1850. There's really not much known about Billy's childhood, but he would be orphaned at a fairly early age. His mother died when he was just 10, and his daddy followed in her wake 2 years later. Luckily, Billy had an uncle over in Missouri willing to take he and his sister in. Unfortunately, said sister would also pass away shortly thereafter from typhoid. According to Dixon, quote, "This left me alone in the world. My uncle was kind and good to me, but I stayed with him only a year. I was a strong, rugged boy, unwilling to be dependent upon even a kinsman for my living, and with much resolution, I decided to seek my fortune. While at my uncle's home, I had often met with men who had been to the far west, and their marvelous tales of adventure fired my imagination and filled me with eagerness to do what they had done. My dreams were filled with beautiful pictures of that dim region that lay towards the Rocky Mountains." End of quote. Now, Billy initially found work cutting wood along the Missouri, before traveling to Leavenworth and falling in with an old bullwhacker named Tom Hare. Apparently, old Tom took a liking to young Dixon and hired him right there on the spot at, quote, $50 a month with everything furnished, including guns and ammunition. Now, from what I could tell just by reading Billy's memoirs, most of his travels as a freighter seem to have taken place between Kansas and what's now Colorado. He got to see buffalo for the first time, he worked closely with the Army, saw a gunfight between a pair of gamblers, and even witnessed the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, and all that before his 18th birthday. Now, if you're not familiar, the Medicine Lodge Treaty was a series of agreements signed in 1867 between the U.S. government and several indigenous nations. The natives agreed to surrender vast tracts of land in exchange for food, housing, and various supplies. And despite the treaty being specifically designed to prevent further conflict, it did prove to be an abject failure, mostly on account of the government not living up to their end of the bargain. Not only did the promised provisions never arrive, but the Army also failed to stop white incursion on native land. A sad series of events that would culminate in a little something known as the Red River War, a conflict in which our very own Billy Dixon would most definitely play a role. In the meantime, however, he was just getting pretty handy with a rifle while working as a freighter. So much so that he was often chosen as the designated hunter. Quote, "There were plenty of quails, rabbits, squirrels, and prairie chickens, and I was in my glory. I ranged the country a youthful Daniel Boone, enjoying every moment of the time. I seemed to have a natural aptitude in the handling of firearms. It was my greatest ambition to become a good shot. In latter years, I was counted an expert marksman in any company, regardless of how proficient my rivals might be. I always attributed my skill with the rifle to my natural love of the sport, to steady nerves, and to constant, unremitting practice. Where other men found pleasure in cards, horse racing, and other similar amusements, I was happiest when ranged in the open country with my gun on my shoulder and a dog at my heels, far out among the wild birds and the wild animals." Now, Billy would continue working with those mule trains until the fall of 1869. That's when he and a few of his buddies went on a trapping and hunting expedition along the Saline River there in Kansas. Of course, that's also when folks started paying good money for buffalo hides. So the following spring is when Billy and his pars went full-time hunting bison. Keep in mind that by this point, 1870, there were still an estimated 5.5 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. Nowhere near as many as decades prior, but there was still enough to support 250,000 Native Americans, all the way from Texas up to Canada. This would change drastically over the next decade, mostly on account of the hide hunters. By 1880, there were less than 400,000, and by the turn of the century, there were only 300 remaining buffalo. Now, like I said, this was mostly due to market hunting, but there were other factors as well. In fact, from 1830 to 1870, the number of bison dropped from an estimated 40 million down to less than 6 million. And this was before guys like Billy Dixon even picked up a rifle. Believe it or not, part of this was due to horses. After all, it was the horse that allowed many of the Great Plains tribes to become extremely efficient hunters. And those same horses were competing with the buffalo for resources. There was also a series of droughts, along with a disruption in movement due to migrant travel and settlements, and even diseases from domestic cattle. So yeah, the buffalo really weren't doing all that well, even prior to the hide hunters. But that said, it was ultimately the hide hunters who were responsible for hammering that final nail into the coffin. I'm just not sure if they were fully aware of what they were doing. Not trying to excuse their actions, I personally find it revolting that they would just take the hides and the tongues and pretty much leave the rest to rot. But I do think there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding the hide hunters. For the most part, they were just in it for the money. Simple as that. Once again, I'm not excusing their actions, but I do think a little bit of nuance is important when discussing these topics. Now, initially, Billy and his partners did all their hunting north of the Arkansas River, mostly because everything to the south was legally off limits. This is the land that was set aside for the natives in the aforementioned Medicine Lodge Treaty. According to Dixon, quote, "The Arkansas was called the dead line, south of which no hunter should go. The river was patrolled at intervals by government troops, as a feeble indication that the Medicine Lodge Treaty had not been forgotten. But their vigilance was so lax that there was no difficulty in crossing back and forth without detection. The danger of attack by Indians was a far more potent obstacle to the buffalo hunter. But as the buffaloes grew fewer in number and the price of hides advanced, even this did not deter hardy hunters from undertaking forays into the forbidden country." So yeah, in other words, the buffalo were getting sparse up in Kansas. Guys like Dixon had to travel further and further just to locate bison. So eventually, in the fall of 1872, he threw caution to the wind and headed south to that quote-unquote forbidden country. And despite almost immediately noticing an abundance of sign indicating the presence of Native Americans, he also found an abundance of buffalo. Or as Dixon put it, buffalo had begun coming in by the thousands, so we agreed to remain 2 or 3 days and make as big a kill as possible. And as luck would have it, they made it out unscathed. Ended up hauling their hides back to Dodge City and selling them for a whopping $2,000, which, adjusted for inflation, is over $50,000 in today's money. That's what I meant earlier when I said that these guys were mostly financially motivated. In a lot of ways, this buffalo hunting was very similar to beaver trapping decades prior, at least in the sense that both occupation caused men to leave the safety of civilization and risk their scalps for a payday. It's my opinion that it was this money, more than a hatred of the indigenous or even government policy, that ultimately led to the demise of the bison. Now, Dixon and his buddies would head south yet again the following spring, traveling as far as Palo Duro Canyon, and once again, they made out like bandits. According to Billy, quote, "It was sometime in February 1874 when we got back to Dodge. We had seen enough to satisfy us that the thing to do would be to go down on the Canadian as soon as the weather settled. While waiting, we went out northwest of Dodge on my old hunting grounds. This is the last hunting I ever did north of the Arkansas. My face was set toward the forbidden country, where the Indians were looking for the scalps of white men." End of quote. Now, be that as it may, it wasn't until later on that march that Billy fell in with a group of like-minded hunters looking to do the same. That said, there were a few logistical issues. First, they needed to figure out how to easily resupply on ammo and various provisions. They'd also need a way to sell their hides without making constant trips back and forth to Kansas. This was solved by merchant A.C. Myers. Basically, he worked out a system where the hunters, like Billy Dixon, would load their wagons with the same sort of supplies they would normally use on the range. Myers would cover the cost, and once they established their camp south of the deadline, he would then sell the provisions to the hunters at a reasonable price. And yeah, so it were in either late March or early May that a caravan of 50 hunters and 30 wagons departed Dodge City, bound for the Texas Panhandle, Billy Dixon among them. Now, while some of these hunters had considerable experience and others were veterans of the Civil War, there were a few that Billy described as quote-unquote tenderfeet. One in particular, a guy known as Fairchild, was even going around bragging about what a mean little ass kicker he was, and saying that he was going to kill the first Indian that so much as looked at him. As nerve-grating as I'm sure that was, it also put the entire party at risk. You see, the hunters had all agreed that the best course of action was to remain peaceful unless attacked. Or as Billy put it was agreed that if we should encounter Indians and find them manifesting friendship, we would do likewise. This is their country, we argued, and if they would leave us alone, we would do the same. In other words, they didn't need a douchebag like Fairchild kicking the hornet's nest and putting the rest of them in danger. So they decided to teach him a lesson. Long story short, but they had a few guys slip out of camp and fire off their guns to make it seem like they were under attack. And it worked. They frightened Fairchild so badly that he was begging to go back to Dodge City. And when he finally figured out the whole thing was just a joke, he, quote, refused to eat breakfast and sulked for several days. This cured him, however, of wanting to kill an Indian, and ever afterwards he was a good hunter and a good feller. End of quote. So there you have it, a little frontier hazing. Now, eventually the hunters arrived at what would become their permanent camp, about 90 or so miles northeast of present-day Amarillo, Texas, a little place known as Adobe Walls. This post first came into being in 1843 to establish trade with the Comanches. The only problem was the Comanche proved unagreeable, so the endeavor was abandoned after just a few years. Charles Bent tried to reopen the walls at least twice before finally giving up and blowing it apart with gunpowder. And that's how it remained until November of 1864. That's when the famous Kit Carson used what was left of the walls to rest his troops after attacking a Kiowa village. What followed was the First Battle of Adobe Walls, as Carson and the soldiers found themselves under attack by an estimated 1,400 warriors. I do have an episode on this battle if you'd like to learn more, a link down below. But simply put, Carson and his men got their asses handed to them, and the walls would remain abandoned for another decade. So yeah, right off the bat, this place doesn't exactly have all that great of a track record, right? But I suppose all that good hide money helped to ease the anxiety. And as you'll soon hear, Dixon and his fellow hunters were basically lulled into complacency. Now, just as soon as Billy and the others arrived there at the walls, they went ahead and raised a couple of stores, along with a sod house to serve as a saloon. They also built a corral for the horses, a mess house, and even a blacksmith shop. So all in all, danger notwithstanding, it really wasn't a bad setup. And even more importantly, there was a ton of buffalo. Matter of fact, Dixon managed to kill so many that he had to return to the walls and hire an additional skinner. That said, the good times wouldn't last forever. Wasn't long until 4 of Dixon's fellow hide hunters were found dead and scalped. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this caused a good deal of excitement. But nevertheless, despite this clear warning from the locals, the hunters refused to call it quits. Rather than abandon such a rich hunt, they instead began traveling in larger groups. I guess thinking maybe that there'd be strength in numbers. They also tried to stay north of the walls under the assumption that the Comanches were in their usual summer camps to the south. And yeah, they pretty much fell into a rhythm. The hunters would fan out into the surrounding prairie, set up satellite camps, and take as many hides as they could fit in their wagons. And then, after unloading them at the walls and stocking up on ammo, they'd head out once again. Believe it or not, after a very short amount of time, they had all but forgotten about those 4 scalped hunters that I mentioned a moment ago. Dixon would even admit to it later on, stating that there was not the, quote, slightest feeling of impending danger. And that really blows my mind. I know hindsight's 2020, but these guys were smack dab in the middle of Comancheria, home to some of the fiercest warriors who had ever strung a bow. And the hunters, despite already losing 4 of their own, were taking very little in the way of precautions. And it was this carelessness that damn near put them under. As fate would have it, Dixon was back there at the walls on June 26, 1874, just preparing for another long hunt. And as far as he and the others were concerned, everything was hunky-dory. Quote, several hunters had come in that day, and we planned to stay up late that night celebrating our return to the range, telling stories of past experiences and joking about how much money we would have when the hunt was over. The night was sultry, and we sat with open doors. In all that vast wilderness, ours were the only lights save for the stars that glittered above us. There was just a handful of us out there on the plains, each bound to the other by the common tie of standing together in the face of any danger that threatened us. It was a simple code, but about the best I know of. Outside could be heard at intervals the muffled sound of the stock moving and stumbling, or a picketed horse shaking himself as he paused in his hunt for grass. In the timber along Adobe Walls Creek to the east, owls were hooting. We paid no attention to these things, however, and in our fancied security against all foes, frolicked and had a general good time. Hannaran did a thriving trade. Hannaran, of course, was the saloon owner. Matter of fact, it was Hannaran's saloon that ended up saving their lives. You see, early the next morning, round about 2 a.m., the hide hunters were jolted awake by what sounded like a rifle. They investigated, and it just turned out to be a cracked ridgepole over at Hannaran's saloon, which they immediately began fixing to stop the roof from collapsing. And by the time they were done, it was too late to go back to sleep, so Billy just started packing up his wagon to get an early start. And that's when all hell broke loose. According to Dixon, quote, turning to my bed, I rolled it up and threw it on the front of my wagon. As I turned to pick up my gun, which lay on the ground, I looked in the direction of our horses. They were in sight, but something else caught my eye. Just beyond the horses, at the edge of some timber, was a large body of objects advancing vaguely in the dusky dawn toward our stock, and in the direction of Adobe Walls. Though keen of vision, I could not make out what the objects were, even by straining my eyes. Then I was thunderstruck. The black body of moving objects suddenly spread out like a fan, and from it went up one single solid yell, a war whoop that seemed to shake the very air of the early morning. Then came the thundering roar of running horses, and the hideous cries of individual warriors, each embarked in the onslaught. I could see that hundreds of Indians were coming. Had it not been for that ridgepole, all of us would have been asleep. By the way, on this day in particular, there were only 28 men and 1 woman there at the walls. Everyone else was out hunting bison. And here they were being attacked by a combined force of around 700 Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne. As for Dixon, he managed to dive headfirst into Hannaran's saloon, just as the bullets were whipping up dust all around him. It was there where he was joined by the proprietor, James Hannaran, along with Bat Masterson and 6 others. The rest of the defenders were spread out between the 2 stores. And yeah, that is the same Bat Masterson who would go on to become friends with Wyatt Earp. Supposedly, at just 20 years of age, Bat was the youngest of the defenders there at the walls. Now, believe it or not, those charging warriors would get so close that they were able to strike the outside of the saloon with the butts of their rifles. Or at least they were before Billy and the others drove them back. To once more quote Dixon, time and again, with the fury of a whirlwind, the Indians charged upon the building, only to sustain greater losses than they were able to inflict. This was a losing game, and if the Indians kept it up, we stood a fair chance of killing most of them. I am sure that we surprised the Indians as badly as they surprised us. They expected to find us asleep, unprepared for an attack. Their medicine man had told them that all they would have to do was to come to Adobe Walls and knock us on the head with sticks, and that our bullets would not be strong enough to break an Indian's skin. The old man was a bad prophet. Now that prophet in question was a Comanche holy man named Isite. He had somehow convinced his people that he could both raise the dead and stop bullets. All they had to do was embrace his power, his medicine, and they could finally defeat the white man once and for all. Sounds pretty crazy, but keep in mind that many modern-day Christians have prophets of their own, some of whom recently predicted a rapture that failed to materialize. Again. Look, there's never been a shortage of false prophets looking to take advantage of the desperate, right? I can't help but think of this family I knew growing up. We actually went to the same church, and they had a daughter who was very, very sick. They went to all the specialists, they had her on dialysis, they were doing everything they were supposed to do, but nothing worked. So finally, out of desperation, they took her to a faith healer. I'm not going to say the guy's name, but he's a very famous televangelist worth millions of dollars. These parents were good, salt-of-the-earth people, and they gave their hard-earned money to a professional con artist. Why? Because they were desperate. At that point in time, they were willing to do anything they possibly could to save their little girl, up to and including putting their faith in a charlatan. Point being, desperate people will oftentimes do things that don't necessarily make sense to the rest of us, and the Comanche were certainly no exception. Keep in mind that they had been ravaged by disease. Their territory was growing smaller and smaller, their enemies were closing in on all sides, and the buffalo, the one thing they relied upon to feed their children, was vanishing before their very eyes. So yeah, by 1874, the Comanche were getting desperate. And it was partly this desperation, in my opinion, that led to many of them putting their faith in Isite. Now, like I said earlier, the hide hunters were successful in fending off that initial charge. The warriors would make a few more half-hearted attempts, but by later on that afternoon, they had pulled back out of range. Fight still wasn't over, though. Dixon and the others may have kept the hostiles at bay with those big guns, but they only had a finite supply of ammunition. And to make matters worse, all of their horses, save for a handful, had either been killed or run off. In other words, they had no other option but to remain where they were and just hope for the best. That said, they would begin venturing out of the buildings later on that evening. Only 3 of the hide hunters had been killed, so they conducted a quick burial and started dragging off some of the dead horses to cut down on the stench. Following day, they and the Comanches briefly exchanged fire from a distance, but that was pretty much it. It wasn't until the 3rd day of the siege, on June 28, 1874, that Billy Dixon pulled off what's now known as the shot of the century. If you don't mind, I'll let Billy explain what happened in his own words. On the 3rd day, a party of about 15 Indians appeared on the side of the bluff east of Adobe Walls Creek, and some of the boys suggested that I try my big 50 on them. The distance was not far from 3/4 of a mile. I took careful aim and pulled the trigger. We saw an Indian fall from his horse. The others dashed out of sight behind a clump of timber. A few moments later, 2 Indians ran quickly on foot to where the dead Indian lay, seized his body, and scurried to cover. They had risked their lives, as we had frequently observed, to rescue a comrade who might not only be wounded, but dead. I was admittedly a good marksman, yet this was what might be called a scratch shot. End of quote. Now, just in case you weren't paying attention, Billy just shot a mounted warrior at a distance of 3/4 of a mile, or a little over 1,300 yards. We'll discuss this more in just a minute, but a shot like that is beyond impressive. It also may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, you gotta think, the Comanches were already demoralized by failing to secure an easy victory. One of their top fighters, Quanah Parker, had been wounded. That medicine man Isite, he had his horse shot out from underneath him. And then, on top of all that, here was this Billy Dixon guy killing one of them from damn near a mile away. As far as the Comanches were concerned, this was bad medicine all around. And from that point on, the fight was basically over. Hunters soon began straggling in from the outlying camps, and by day 6, they had about 100 men to help hold off any remaining hostiles. Sadly, however, there was an additional fatality. One of the defenders, William Olds, accidentally blew his head off while climbing down a ladder. If you recall, it was Olds who was the husband of the lone woman there at the walls. According to Dixon, quote, "Just as I entered Rath's store, I saw Olds coming down the ladder with his gun in his hand. A moment later, his gun went off accidentally, tearing off the top of Old's head. At the same instant, Mrs. Olds rushed in from an adjoining room, in time to see the body of her husband roll from the ladder and crumple at her feet, a torrent of blood gushing from the terrible wound. Olds died instantly. Gladly would I have faced all of the Indians from the Cimarron to the Red River, rather than to have witnessed this terrible scene. It seemed to me that it would have been better for any other man there to have been taken than the husband of the only woman among us. Her grief was intense and pitiable. A rough lot of men, such as we were, did not know how to comfort a woman in such distress. We did the best we could, and if we did it awkwardly, it should not be set down against us. Had we been called upon to fight for her, we would not have asked about the odds, but would have sailed in tooth and toenail. But when we tried to speak to her, we just choked up and stood still. We buried Olds that same evening, about 60 feet from the spot where he was killed, just southeast of Rath's store. End of quote. Now, before we go any further, I do want to circle back real quick and address Billy's famous shot. Even though he said it was 3/4 of a mile, the distance was actually measured later on, and it turned out to be around 1,500 yards. Just in case there's anyone listening who may not be all that familiar with firearms, hitting a target at 1,500 yards is extremely difficult, especially if you're not using a scope. I'll put it to you like this. You can give the average person a modern-day, high-powered rifle with the most expensive scope that money can buy, and chances are they still wouldn't be able to hit the broadside of a barn at 1,500 yards. Myself included. Hell, even a trained marksman would struggle to hit a target at 1,500 yards. I remember watching this TV show years ago, and there was a couple of ex-military guys. I want to say one of them was a Navy SEAL, but I could be misremembering. And they were out in the middle of the desert trying to recreate a shot made by a Canadian sniper in Afghanistan. And despite the shooters being highly trained and using top-of-the-line equipment, they still weren't able to pull it off. Now granted, they were aiming it over 2 miles away, but their conclusion was that while the Canadian sniper was most definitely highly skilled, I mean, you gotta be highly skilled to even get close to a target at that distance, but it was their opinion that luck played a role. And I do think the same thing can be said for Billy Dixon. Just to further illustrate how difficult this is, there was an editor for Guns Magazine, Mike Venturino, who attempted to recreate Dixon's shot about a decade ago. They had this 4x8 sheet of plywood that they painted white and then set up at 1,500 yards. And according to Mr. Venturino, quote, "Altogether we, 13 shooters, fired a total of 151 rounds. Periodically, we ceased fire and had our spotter inspect the target area. There were grooves in the soft ground on the other side of the plywood and in front and behind it. Finally, in the afternoon, a local 13-year-old named Connor lofted a bullet that landed just in front of the target and penetrated on its bounce. Later, Bozeman resident Rich Morris, firing his own Shiloh 45-70, got a solid hit that, surprisingly, bounced off the plywood. So did Billy Dixon actually hit that Indian at 1,500 yards? Maybe, but I couldn't." End of quote. Now, full disclosure, Billy Dixon was shooting a rifle chambered in 50-90 as opposed to 45-70, so he would have definitely had a bit more stopping power, but I think you get the picture, right? No matter what kind of a gun you're using, it is not easy hitting a target, even a big target, at 1,500 yards, especially with open sights. Not only does it take a whole hell of a lot of skill, but it also takes some good old-fashioned luck. And he did it on the first try. Now, like I said earlier, the battle was pretty much over by that third day. And unfortunately for the Comanche, their time as the lords of the southern plains was also quickly drawing to an end. It was just 3 months later when the army caught them with their pants down over at Palo Duro Canyon. Casualties were light, but the soldiers were able to destroy not only their winter village, but also around 1,000 Comanche ponies. And without food or sufficient mounts, they really had no other choice but to report to the reservation. That wasn't until late September, though. In the meantime, Billy Dixon would find himself in yet another fight for his life, one that would end up earning him the prestigious Medal of Honor. You see, after that battle there at Adobe Walls, Billy took a job as a civilian scout under General Nelson Miles. He and 4 soldiers, along with another scout named Amos Chapman, were delivering dispatches when they ran smack dab into a force of around 100 Comanches and Kiowas. And since they were completely surrounded with nowhere to hide, they simply dismounted right there on the prairie and tried to make a stand of it. By the way, in case you're curious, this was about 20 or so miles from present-day Canadian Texas. Now, although Dixon and his compadres were initially able to keep their opponents at bay, they paid a very heavy price. Private George W. Smith took a bullet through his lung and was presumed dead. Their horses were stampeded, and everyone else, including Dixon, sustained wounds. That's when Billy noticed a nearby waller. Quote, "Our situation was growing more desperate every minute. I knew something had to be done and quickly, or else all of us in a short while would be dead or in the hands of the Indians, who would torture us in the most inhumane manner before taking our lives. I could see where the buffaloes had pawed and wallowed a depression, commonly called a buffalo waller, and I ran for it at top speed. It seemed as if a bullet whizzed past me at every jump, but I got through unharmed. The waller was about 10 feet in diameter. I found its depth, though slight, afforded some protection. I shouted to my comrades to try to come to me, which all of them, save for Smith and Chapman, commenced trying to do. As each man reached the waller, he drew his butcher knife and began digging desperately with knife in hands to throw up dirt around the sides. The land happened to be sandy, and we made good headway, though constantly interrupted by the necessity of firing at the Indians as they dashed within range. Now, shortly thereafter is when Dixon rushed out to save his fellow scout, Amos Chapman. He ended up tossing the wounded man across his back and carrying him to the waller under a hail of bullets. He also tried retrieving Smith, but it was just too damn hot. I guess Billy didn't want to risk his life for what he and the others assumed was a dead man. And yeah, for the next few hours, they just laid there baking under the hot Texas sun and doing their level best to hold off the hostiles. Thankfully, they had a rainstorm to quench their thirst later on that evening, but said storm also ushered in a blue norther. So they basically went from sweltering to freezing their asses off in the matter of just a few minutes. They were also running low on bullets. So that being the case, one of the soldiers, Private Peter Roth, ran out to grab Smith's rifle and ammunition. And in doing so, he was shocked to discover that Smith was still alive. That's when Dixon ran out to help, and they were able to carry him back to the waller, but sadly, Private Smith would succumb to his wounds later on that night. Of course, by morning time, the Comanches had already broken off their attack, so Billy set out on foot looking for help. As luck would have it, he was able to locate several companies of the 8th Cav under a Major William Price. And believe it or not, Price just left them there. I'm not making this up. The Major had a surgeon check out their wounds, and some of the soldiers handed out hardtack, but that's it. They weren't given any bullets, no spare horses, nothing. Price just simply left them there with the promise that he would inform General Miles of their whereabouts. So Billy and his compadres were forced to spend another day right there in the waller before finally being rescued. Now, like I said, Dixon would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, but it was later rescinded by Congress on account of him being a civilian. That said, the Army would reinstate the award well over a century later, in 1989. As for Dixon, he'd continue scouting until 1883. That's when he returned to the Panhandle and established a little homestead within spitting distance of Adobe Walls. He got married about a decade later to a Miss Olive King, and they would have a total of 7 children, the last of whom passed away as recently as 1995. In fact, 2 of his sons, Hugh and Archie, would even serve during the Second World War. And yeah, for the next few decades, Dixon worked as a sheriff, a rancher, justice of the peace, land commissioner, and even a postmaster. The family would move to Cimarron, Oklahoma in 1906, and it's there on March 9th, 1913, at the age of 62, that the great Billy Dixon finally passed away from pneumonia. But not before dictating his memoirs to his wife Olive. In fact, Olive would spend pretty much the rest of her life dedicated to preserving and promoting Billy's legacy. She actually went into debt publishing his memoirs. She also got a small monument placed there at the site of the Buffalo Waller fight, as well as a grave marker for Private Smith. And then finally, on June 27, 1929, exactly 55 years to the day of the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, Olive had her late husband's body reinterred right there on the battleground. And it's there where Billy Dixon rests to this day, not far from the men he had helped bury. Mrs. Dixon would pass away herself just a year later. She had gone out to eat barbecue with her daughter Edna and her son-in-law, and on the drive home, she just quietly slumped over on her daughter's shoulder, and that was that. And look, I don't want to make light of Mrs. Dixon's death, but hey, we all gotta die at some point, right? And I don't know about you, but me personally, I don't think I'd mind going out in the exact same fashion. Just quietly passing to the other side with a belly full of Texas barbecue. Now, before we wrap things up, I would like to mention one last thing regarding the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. I mentioned earlier how the hunters were all woken up at around 2 a.m. by what sounded like the crack of a rifle, only to then discover it was that broken lodgepole over at Hanaran's Saloon. Well, per legend, Mr. Hannaran was tipped off to the impending attack days prior, and he didn't tell anyone because he thought it would hurt his business. Apparently, he got nervous the morning of and fired off his rifle to wake everyone up. And then when they came to investigate, he just made up the story about the cracked lodgepole. For what it's worth, I don't think this has ever been proven, and I personally would love to see a primary source on Hannaran having prior knowledge of the attack. But this theory was somewhat corroborated by Billy Dixon. He would claim in his memoirs that he and several other hunters examined the ridgepole, and they never located a crack or a split. So make of that what you will. Also, another theory that, so far as I'm aware, has not been proven. But if you remember the scene from Young Guns 2, where Deputy Carlisle got killed over at White Oaks, well, there was a Carlisle right there at Adobe Walls, who Billy Dixon referred to as Bermuda Carlisle. And there are some who think that the Adobe Walls Carlisle and the White Oaks Carlisle were one and the same. Like I said, I don't know how true this is, but it's fun to think about. I mean, can you imagine surviving a fight like Adobe Walls and having a badass nickname like Bermuda, only to then be gunned down by your own posse just a few years later, without barbecue? But yeah, on that note, I guess that's about all I've got on Billy Dixon. Thank you so much for joining me. Please head on over to wildwestextramerch.com and pick up some swag. And if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and close things out with the final passage from Billy's memoirs, The Life and Adventures of Billy Dixon, which, if you haven't already read, you are definitely missing out. It really is one of the better biographies as far as the Old West is concerned. But anyway, here we go. Quote, I feared that the conquest of savagery in the Southwest was due more often to the love of adventure than to any wishes that cities should arise in the desert, or that the highways of civilization should take the place of the trails of the Indian and the buffalo. In fact, many of us believed and hoped that the wilderness would remain forever. Life there was to our liking. Its freedom, its dangers, its tax upon the strength and courage all gave zest to the living, especially to young men, unapproached by anything to be found in civilized communities. Therefore, let it be said that if there was bravery and heroism, it came less by design than it did from the emergencies of accident and surroundings. That the Indian should have resisted, with relentless and increasing ferocity, every effort to drive him from his paradise was natural and justifiable from his point of view. In those days, he felt that to go somewhere else meant starvation and death for his family and tribe. Above all, he firmly believed that the country was his, as it had been from the beginning, and that the white man was cruel, merciless, and wrong in depriving him of his old home, a home that the white man did not need and would not use. I am often questioned about my experiences on the frontier, as if the life had been filled with unbearable hardships, to be shunned and forgotten. Gladly would I live it all over again, such is my cast of mind and my hunger for the freedom of the big wide places. I would run the risk and endure all the hardships that were naturally ours, just for the contentment and freedom to be found in such an outdoor life. I should be unspeakably happy once more to feast on buffalo meat and other wild game cooked on a campfire, sourdough biscuit and black coffee, the latter drank from a quart cup. But those days are gone forever, and we must content ourselves with the present and make the best of our opportunities. Coming generations will never know the trials and hardships we endured. We helped build a great empire in the West. Let it be governed justly and made to serve the needs of humanity. Yeehaw! They say Stagecoach Mary stood over 6 feet tall and feared no one but God. She worked hard, she drank hard, and if the situation called for it, she fought hard. And despite being born a slave, Mary lived to become one of the freest souls to ever draw a breath, or a .38 revolver. Join me today as we examine the life of Mary Fields, a woman who could whip any 2 men in Montana territory. A lady whose fondness for hard liquor was matched only by her capacity to put it away. Or at least that's according to a very famous actor who knew Stagecoach Mary personally. Ooh, who could it be? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Mary Fields was born a slave sometime around the year 1832 on a plantation in Hickman County, Tennessee. Maybe. As tends to be the case, especially with former slaves, there's just not a lot of information out there regarding Mary's early life. Some sources claim that her mother worked in the big house while her father labored in the fields. Others say she was born in Florida and sold to the Warner family out of West Virginia. Whatever the case, we do know that by 1870, Mary had gained her freedom and was working as a chambermaid on a steamboat ironically called the Robert E. Lee. In fact, she was even on board for the historic race between the Lee and the steamboat Natchez. Mary would fondly recall how they threw pretty much everything they could find in the fire just to produce enough steam to make it to the finish line, even entire sides of ham. And apparently it worked, as the Lee beat the Natchez by a solid 6.5 hours. No word on how many chamber pots Mary emptied during the race, but something tells me she had one hell of a celebration on deck later that night. As you'll soon learn, Mary Fields did enjoy having a good time. Now her next job was up in Toledo, Ohio. But once again, it's not exactly clear how she wound up there. Legend has it that she met Judge Edmund Dunn aboard the Robert E. Lee, and he was so impressed by her work ethic that he hired her right there on the spot. Then again, there were other stories asserting that Mary was owned by the judge's in-laws, the Warner family, prior to emancipation. Either way, Mary would become fast friends with the judge's sister, Sarah, who, as it turns out, was a Roman Catholic nun, an Ursuline nun, to be exact. Now, I had never heard of that before, Ursuline, but according to Encyclopedia Britannica, it's a Roman Catholic religious order of women founded in 1535 and dedicated exclusively to the education of girls. And yeah, it wasn't long before Mary Fields began living and working at the convent, right alongside her new friend Sarah. Not as a nun, but more of a hired hand, a job she did not take lightly, by the way. Part of her duties entailed tending to the garden and a courtyard. And you better believe she did not put up with anyone trampling her daggum grass. Or as one of the nuns put it, God help anyone who walked on the lawn after Mary had cut it. Now, I'm not exactly sure when Mary began working at the convent, but she would stay there until the 1880s. That's when Bishop John Bondell reached out to the Ursulines looking for a little assistance. The Jesuit missionaries out in Montana had spent the last 2 decades running relief stations and missions for the local indigenous, namely the Blackfeet. And now they were hoping that the nuns could open up a boarding school. As such, Mary's friend Sarah, who by that point was going by the name Mother Amadeus, packed her bags and headed west. Now, me personally, I have not yet had the pleasure of visiting Montana, but I hear it can get just a wee bit chilly in the wintertime. And it was those frigid temperatures that damn near put Mother Amadeus under. She ended up coming down with a pretty serious case of pneumonia, and when word made it back to Toledo, Mary caught a train and rushed to her side. Per historian Meante M. McConnell, quote, Mother Amadeus would not leave these girls. The pioneer nuns had run out of food and money. Their sole source of heat, an iron stove, would not alleviate frostbit limbs without fuel. Following school lessons taught during the day, the undernourished sisters and their indigenous pupils slept on the frozen earth floor. And Mary Fields would too. She had decided to stay. End of quote. And yeah, not only would Mary stay, but she also began working to improve conditions there at the mission, which, by the way, was located about 10 or so miles west of Cascade, Montana. And when I say work, I'm talking grown man work, okay? Mary Fields literally did it all. She hunted and trapped for food, she cut and hauled firewood, she raised chickens, did laundry, tended to the garden, she even helped prepare the altar for Mass. You name it, Mary did it. And just an FYI, but if you think Montana is white nowadays, back in the mid-1880s, it was really white. I'm talking going to Weezer concerts and eating nothing but egg salad sandwiches white. You gotta think, back in those days, Montana had a population of less than 100,000. And out of all those people, only a few hundred of them were black. That being the case, it did take a while for the locals to warm up to Mary. Even the Jesuits didn't know what to make of her, at least not at first. That said, in all fairness, I'm not really sure how much of that had to do with Mary's skin tone, as opposed to her somewhat unconventional behavior. Remember what I said earlier about Mary liking to have a good time. She may have bunked with a passel of nuns, but she still cursed like a sailor, smoked cigars, and drank whiskey by the gallon. She also didn't take no shit, especially from men, an attitude that would lead to more than a few altercations, both verbal and physical. Like the time she got into a fist fight with a cowboy, or when she and another hired hand there at the mission got into an actual gunfight. Or at least that's how the story goes. Unfortunately, the details have been lost to history. So much so that we don't even know for sure if the gunfight truly occurred. Some say that pistols were drawn and bullets did indeed start flying, but nobody was hurt. Others say that Mary and the unnamed man simply touched rifles and exchanged a few not-so-pleasant pleasantries. Like I said, the details are unknown, but whatever went down would cause Mary to lose her job there at the mission. Remember, they were trying to teach young girls the finer points of Victorian etiquette, and I guess pistol duels weren't exactly part of the curriculum. Bishop Bondell had already heard stories concerning Mary's other proclivities, the cursing and the drinking, so I guess he had finally had enough and gave her the boot. The nuns there at the mission were heartbroken, to say the least, and for good reason. Mary had spent the last decade completely devoted to the Ursuline sisters, only to be unceremoniously thrown to the curb. Luckily for Fields, Mother Amadeus was able to set her up with a restaurant in nearby Cascade. Only problem was, despite Mary's rough exterior, her heart was just as big as that Montana sky. Or to paraphrase the great Chris Knight, sometimes the hardest of edges can hide the tenderest of hearts. You see, Mary couldn't stand to see people go hungry, so she gave away more food than she charged for, especially to the struggling sheep herders. And after failing to turn a profit, the restaurant predictably went belly up. So Mother Amadeus stepped in yet again, helped Mary out with a second restaurant, but just like before, she couldn't stop giving away the food. That's when the nuns encouraged Mary to become a star route carrier for the U.S. Postal Service. Now, from what I understand, star route carriers were private contractors who bid on specific mail routes, especially in more rural or hard-to-reach areas. They were paid per trip and operated under the strict standards of celerity, certainty, and security. In other words, be fast, be reliable, and pretty please do not lose the GD mail. Mary had to prove that she could hitch a 6-horse team as part of the interview. Not only did she succeed, but she was also faster than the men applying for the job. And that being the case, Mary Fields became the second woman in all of history and the very first black woman to ever work as a star route carrier. Now, there's a lot of questionable information floating around out there, especially online, but one of the best biographies I was able to locate on Mary came from Ebony magazine, way back in 1959, courtesy of Gary Cooper. Yeah, that Gary Cooper, the guy from High Noon and Sergeant York. Turns out Cooper was born in Helena and spent a lot of time over in Cascade when he was a child. He personally knew Mary and had many a fond memory. It was Cooper I was quoting earlier when I said that Mary could whip any 2 men in the territory, and that she had a fondness for hard liquor that was matched only by her capacity to put it away. Quote, "They gave Mary the route between Cascade and the mission itself, and every day, never missing a one, she made her triumphant entry into the mission seated atop a mail coach, dressed in a man's hat and coat and smoking a huge cigar. Mary met every train and oftentimes slept in the depot. In bad weather, if Mary's coach could not get through, she would shoulder the luggage and walk. She drove the route for 8 years." End of quote. Worth noting that Mary never did drive an actual stagecoach, despite her nickname. In all reality, it was a mail coach, sort of like a buggy. I'm not really sure when or why people took to calling her Stagecoach Mary, but Gary Cooper knew her as Black Mary. Other locals would talk of how she kept a jug of whiskey there at her feet when driving the coach, and that she was always heavily armed. They say Mary kept a .38 revolver belted around her waist, and either a rifle or a 10-gauge shotgun close at hands at all times, causing the road agents to keep a wide berth. And then there's the way she dressed, which we've already kind of sort of touched on. Apparently, Mary's uniform of choice was a skirt, skull cap, and a man's heavy overcoat, along with a ever-present cigar clenched between her teeth. Thus provisioned, Mary set out alone across the prairie, no matter the conditions. According to historian William Katz, quote, "One night while hauling freight to St. Peter's, wolves attacked her wagon. The horses bolted, wagons, supplies, and a surprised Mary Fields landed on a Montana prairie. It was a lonely and fearful night, but with a rifle and pistol, along with an iron determination not to fall asleep, Mary Fields kept the wolves at bay." Another time, during a bitter winter, she was driving her wagon from Cascade to the mission. A light snowfall turned to a blizzard, whipped by strong winds. It was no use going forward, for it was not possible to see more than a few feet. Mary Fields got down from the wagon and waited out the storm, walking back and forth all night to keep from freezing. End of quote. So yeah, very tough lady, right? But here's the thing. Mary didn't get that job with the Postal Service until she was in her 60s. And she continued doing it for damn near the next decade. Finally, in 1903, Mother Amadeus was called to Alaska for missionary work.
sadly leaving her friend Mary behind. Of course, by that point, Mary was getting a little too long in the tooth to be taking on new frontiers. So it were, at over 70 years of age, Stagecoach Mary finally retired. Kind of. I guess I should say she retired from driving the coach. But she did not stop working. She simply settled down full-time there in Cascade and began operating a laundry out of her house. And this semi-retirement aside, Mary was just as wild as ever. There's even stories of her betting men that she could knock them out in one punch. And legend has it, Mary never lost a bet. Then there's the time one of her customers tried to make off with his laundry without paying for it. Mary caught up with him, tapped him on the shoulder, and just as soon as he turned around, she belted him in the mouth. She then marched to the nearest saloon, ordered a drink, and declared that the man's bill was now paid in full. Speaking of saloons, Mary was not technically allowed to drink there in Cascade, per a city ordinance. But eventually the mayor just passed a new law carving out a special exemption just for her. Guess maybe he didn't want to get punched in the face as well. Now, believe it or not, between all that fighting and drinking, Mary also became the town's designated babysitter. By all accounts, the children loved her, and she doted on them as if they were her own. Even the mayor's son would later recall that Mary was, quote, gentle and loving. She held me in her lap and sang to me with a deep voice. She was a second mother to all of us kids. And one thing that I thought was very amusing was that Mary would randomly throw birthday celebrations for herself, despite not actually knowing her own birthday. Basically whenever the mood struck, sometimes multiple times per year. Just whenever she felt like it, she would declare that it was her birthday. And really, this was just another opportunity for her to hand out candy to the children. How the schools and even some of the businesses would close early just to celebrate Mary's mini birthdays. She was also a huge baseball fan. Not only was she the mascot for the local team, but she would also bring bouquets of flowers to hand out to the players. Just to give you an idea of how beloved Mary truly was, when her house burned down in 1912, the townsfolk all pitched in and built her a new one. The owner of the Cascade Hotel even provided all of Mary's meals free of charge. You don't do that for someone who's not highly respected. And I do think over time, Mary Fields had more than earned her place there amongst the pioneers of Cascade. Eventually, though, the years did start to catch up to her, as tends to happen to us all, right? Mary's health began to fail, and she ended up spending the last month of her life in bed. Finally, one cold December night, she took her blankets outside and laid down in the grass, ready to meet her end under that Montana sky that she had grown to love. Luck would have it, though, some young boys found her and fetched their parents. They were able to rush Mary to the hospital over at Great Falls, where all comfort was given, but by that point, it was just too late. It was there at the hospital on December 5th, 1914, at around the age of 82, that Stagecoach Mary crossed that River Jordan. I forgot to mention it, but Mother Amadeus had passed away a couple months prior, so I can't help but wonder if Mary was just ready to join her old friend on the other side. As it were, her funeral was reportedly the largest the Cascade had ever seen. A priest from St. Peter's delivered mass, and several of the town's leading citizens served as pallbearers. If you're ever looking to pay your respects, you can find Mary still resting at Cascade's Hillside Cemetery. What a life, man. And by the way, if Stagecoach Mary sounds familiar, she has been portrayed by a lot of people throughout the years. The very talented Zazie Beetz in the Netflix original The Harder They Fall. Whoopi Goldberg played her in the movie Outlaw Posse. Esther Roll, Amber Sharday Robinson, Dawn Lewis, and Kimberly Elise have all portrayed Mary. Hell, there's even a children's book, a screenplay, and even a damn asteroid named in Mary's honor. Now, if you'd like to learn more, my buddy Zarin has an excellent episode devoted to Mary on his Black Cowboys podcast. It really is an amazing episode, and I personally really enjoyed hearing the input from Zarin's father, especially the story about the Underground Railroad. Finally, just to wrap things up, there's an article I found on montanaswomenhistory.org that I think does a pretty good job of summing up Mary Fields. My apologies to the author, I was not able to find a name, but the article reads as follows. As the sole African American in Cascade, Fields did not have the benefit of a close-knit black community, such as developed in towns like Helena, Great Falls, Butte, and Fort Benton. And because she was outside the boundaries of respectable womanhood, Fields was in some ways on her own. It is hard to imagine Fields did not feel the sting of prejudice, or at least the friendly contempt described by African-American musician W.C. Handy on a visit to Helena in 1897. Nevertheless, she certainly lived an inspirational life, and one forged on her own terms. She was, in the best sense, a pioneer woman. She was rough and she was tough. And as Gary Cooper opined, she was born a slave but lived to become one of the freest souls ever to draw a breath. End of quote, and there you have it. Stagecoach Mary definitely lived life on her own terms. I guess after spending the first third of her life in chains, Mary refused to be bound by societal norms. She fought, she drank, she cursed, and she toted iron. But through it all, she remained tender enough to cradle Cascade's children and to feed those who weren't able to feed themselves. A legend loved in life and remembered long after her death. The kind of story that the West was made for. And that's about all I've got on Stagecoach Mary.